Hello and welcome everybody to another edition of the Saturdays Are for the Byzantines podcast. My name is Professor Wren. I am your host. Hope you all have had a good week this week. And if you've not done so yet, please go check out my recent video essay on my thoughts in the aftermath of the Kyle Rittenhouse case. It's a new, different thing that I'm thinking about doing on the channel, doing some video essays about things in popular culture, or not really popular culture, current events. Just kind of giving my thoughts on them, and it's not really going to be as much of a lecture style video where I have notes and then I kind of read from the notes at times and give commentary at the times. It's really just going to be I'll type out an essay and then just read it without interjecting anything. So if that's something you guys like, it's gotten a decent amount. It's gotten up in views a lot faster than most of my other videos. I think in no small part because obviously it's a topic that's popular and in the news these days. Even though with the 24-hour news cycle, the Rittenhouse stuff is kind of old news at this point in time. Like I said, I tried to get that essay published in a couple different online publications. No one really took it, although the people I sent it to said it wasn't a bad article, it just didn't fit their curation for what they're looking for. But if you guys like the video essay addition to the channel, leave comments and let me know, and I'll start doing more of them because I would like to kind of branch out and do some things other than history. Obviously, we're starting to wrap up Byzantine history here. We're definitely getting close to the end. I don't want to spend too much more time on this because it's been almost a year. I think in like January, February, it'll be a year since I started this project. And I kind of want to move on to something else, Byzantine history. The start of it is very interesting, late Roman history and the age of Justinian and all that's very interesting. But as you get towards the end of Byzantine history, it really becomes a sad state of affairs. And I'm looking forward to starting another project here. I haven't quite decided what the next project will be, but perhaps you guys can leave in the comments if you have any ideas for future, podcast series, or even if it's just like a mini series, it's a smaller topic in history that would maybe only have like a half dozen episodes worth of content. I'm certainly open to do that as well. But so for today, we're jumping ahead. We left off at the ending of the Comnenian dynasty there with John, starting with Alexius, then John, and then Manuel. And today we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit to the next big event in Byzantine history. And I would argue that this is really it's one of the big endings of Byzantine history. And I think it's really at this point in time that you could even honestly stop Byzantine history, just because the Byzantine Empire, it's as it was, essentially stopped existing, although it does kind of come back into existence and doesn't technically end until 1453. But really the empire kind of as it had been existing for a couple hundred years at that point in time really is no more. But anyway, so we're talking here about the Fourth Crusade. Now, the Fourth Crusade was called by Pope Innocent III, who was Pope from 1198 until 1216. And the Crusade was called in 1202. The target of the Crusade was again Jerusalem, which was still controlled by the Ayyubid dynasty. Although Saladin was no longer alive at this point in time, Jerusalem was lost. And the kingdom of Jerusalem itself was almost put out of commission there in 1187. There was a couple towns left on the coast of the Levant there, like Acre, Tyre, and might have been a couple other ones that were the only holdouts left of the old Crusader states after the conquest of Saladin. This crusade would be continuously hampered by ulterior motives of the people involved, which would end up distracting them from their real goal. And if you know anything about the Fourth Crusade, you know what I'm talking about. And if you don't, you'll see here in a minute. Now, most of the Crusaders who went out on this crusade came from France, although there were smaller groups from the Holy Roman Empire as well as in northern Italy. And Boniface of Montferrat was chosen to lead the crusade. Montferrat is actually a town there in northern Italy. However, he was not on the crusade for long because he went to go visit his cousin, Philip of Swabia, which we'll see is a very important turn of events here as we move forward. Now, by this point in time, the tensions between the Eastern and Western Christians were already pretty high. During the Third Crusade, Frederick Barbarossa nearly sieged Constantinople because he could not get safe passage across the Dardanelles. That's the straits that separate Asia and Europe there by Constantinople. He was promised safe passage, he didn't get it, and in retaliation, he was considering besieging Constantinople, didn't end up ultimately doing so. And then Richard the Lionheart as well conquered the Greek rebels, which were on the island of Cyprus, and then Richard used Cyprus as a base of supply for his endeavors in the Third Crusade. And then afterwards, he ended up selling Cyprus to the Templars instead of giving it back to the Byzantines, although there was not actually an agreement between Richard and the Byzantines that he would give Cyprus back to them. But the Byzantines were certainly peeved that they didn't get it back, because the Greek rebels the Byzantines had controlled Cyprus for quite a while before that. The rebel group took over, and it was at that point that Richard he was actually, interestingly enough, blown off course on his way to the Holy Land and landed on Cyprus. And his men were attacked, and then in the retaliation to the attack, Richard takes over Cyprus. Now, the Crusaders had to find somebody to sail them from Europe to, they wanted to go to Egypt, which was where they planned to start the crusade against the Ayyubids, because by this point in time, the notion of marching across Europe, down through the Balkans, through Byzantine territory, across Anatolia, had kind of gone by the wayside. There was not really any interest in that. They were basically, at this point, all of the Crusades are sailing. And both Venice and Genoa, both blossoming Italian city-states, were asked to do the job, and Venice was the one who agreed to it. Now, Venice spent about a year building enough ships to transport the roughly 33,500 soldiers to the Holy Land. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, led the Venetian fleet and Crusader army from Venice in June of 1203. So they depart from all the Crusaders gathered together in Venice in June of 1203. However, other Venetian interests would prove to be a serious obstacle during the Fourth Crusade. And before the crusade departed, Pope Innocent III, who had called the crusade, explicitly stated that the Crusaders were not to attack other Christians on their campaign, and that doing so would lead to excommunication. Almost as if Pope Innocent here kind of had an idea of what was happening. I do wonder if he had some sort of inkling that perhaps the Venetians were up to no good, as we will see here. Now, at this point in time, the Venetians were at war with the Kingdom of Hungary, and both states were fighting over the island of Zara. Zara was an island in the Adriatic Sea, and it was on the Venetian trade route. Venice controlled, a lot of the islands going down in the Adriatic, and eventually, their influence spread across the Eastern Mediterranean, and so Zara was just an island, again, along a trade route that the Venetians were interested, obviously, in controlling, because the Venetians, as we know, again, if you've studied medieval history at all, the Venetians make a lot of money off sea trade, and so they want to secure Zara for themselves. Now, Enrico Dandolo demanded that the Crusaders fight with the Venetians to take Zara, but the issue here was that Hungary which controlled Zara, was a Catholic kingdom, and actually many of the Crusaders went home, refusing to attack other Catholics on the crusade, especially obviously because, again, the Pope had threatened to excommunicate them if they did so, and so many of the Crusaders said, you know what, excommunication is not worth it. We're just going to head out. So the Crusaders and the Venetians attack and conquer Zara anyway. And when Pope Innocent III heard of this, he sent a letter excommunicating the Fourth Crusade. And this is actually not the last time that the Fourth Crusade is going to be excommunicated, which is just sort of, it's like one excommunication was not enough for them. Apparently they needed a second excommunication just to kind of drive the message home. Now, we mentioned earlier, Boniface of Montferrat went to go visit his cousin, Philip of Swabia, who was hosting the deposed Byzantine Emperor, Alexios IV Angelus. While Boniface was at the court of Philip of Swabia, Alexios IV asked him to assist him to get back to the Byzantine throne. And in exchange, so Alexios IV has been deposed as Byzantine Emperor, and he's trying to persuade Boniface to say, if you and your Crusaders assist me and you overthrow the current Byzantine Emperor and you get me back on the throne, these are the things that I will do for you. And he, as certain members of the Corleone family like to say, he made him an offer he couldn't refuse, right? So here are the promises. So number one, Alexios promises to pay the debt the Crusaders still owed to the Venetians, because they still owed them a good amount of money for building the ships which were transporting them. Number two, to give the Crusaders 200,000 additional silver pieces on top of the paying off their debt to the Venetians. 10,000 professional Byzantine soldiers to fight with the Crusaders, and the supply to maintain 500 knights in the Levant. He also promised that the Byzantine navy would sail the crusade to Egypt instead of the Venetians, and that the Eastern Orthodox Church would go back into communion with Rome, and the Eastern Orthodox Church would follow the Pope. As I said, for Boniface, this was an offer he simply couldn't refuse, although one does have to wonder why he thought that a deposed emperor of what was honestly at the time a dying empire would be able to pony up this magnificent deal. And we'll see here, we'll talk about here in a minute, how a lot of the guys on the crusade, when Boniface comes back and he says, and he presents this plan to a lot of the Crusaders, a lot of them say, he's selling, this Alexios guy, he's selling us a load of crap. And they know he's not going to be able to make good on the offer. And so more people abandon the crusade as time goes on there, but we'll talk about that in a second. Or I guess we'll we'll talk about it now, because at this point in time, most of the other leaders agreed, a lot of Crusaders thought it was a good idea to make the attack on Constantinople, but some certainly refused, such as Reynaud of Montmiral. There were a number of Crusaders who, when they heard about this, they were like, "There's no way that Alexios can actually make good on this promise." But there were a lot of people, like I said, he's promising the farm on this, and so they thought it was a good idea to go forward with it, even though, again, they had already been excommunicated, and attacking Christians again would just lead to further trouble with the Pope. But nonetheless, the Fourth Crusade makes its way to Constantinople to place Alexios IV on the throne. In July of 1203, the Crusaders and the Venetians reach Constantinople, and they expected that the people of the city of Constantinople would welcome them with open arms, and that they wanted Alexios back as their emperor, and they would welcome Alexios back with open arms. But that was not what happened. Instead, the Fourth Crusade had to besiege Constantinople for most of that summer, and with a combined land and sea attack, eventually the Crusaders and the Venetians bust in the city and take it over. Now, the Byzantine Emperor who was already there, who was Alexios III, don't ask about the numbers. It's some of the, the Byzantines, they have like 5 names for their emperors. It's like John, Alexios, Constantine, Isaac, and a few others, right? But so Alexios III was the guy who was emperor at that, who had deposed Alexios IV. He flees the city. Alexios III flees the city when he saw that the city was lost. And Alexios IV's father, Isaac II, then rose to the throne. The Crusaders agreed then to elevate Alexios IV to the position of co-emperor with his father. So Alexios and Isaac are ruling together as co-emperors, essentially, with the Crusaders kind of propping them up now in the city. Now, Alexios IV began to realize that he could not actually keep the promises that he made to the Crusaders. Shock of shocks. He began melting down statues and icons from churches to get the gold off them, right? Because some of the icons have gold in the carvings. But even after that, he was still 100,000 pieces short, 100,000 pieces of gold short, even though he promised them silver, which is interesting. I don't know what the conversion rate on that is, but either way, he could not. Even melting down all the gold from the statues and the churches across Constantinople, he could not print enough money essentially to pay off the Crusaders. And this pissed off the Crusaders, and it also pissed off all the people in the city because he's taken all the gold out of their churches, right? And then Alexios's father dies later on in 1204, leaving him as the sole ruler of the empire, but not for long. Now, just get ready because we're going to get another Alexios here, a guy named Alexios Doukas. We've met the Doukas family before. They're a powerful, influential family in the Byzantine Empire. They have had some emperors in the past, but they're not, obviously they're currently not on the throne at this point in time. However, again, Alexios Doukas led a coup against Alexios IV. Okay, just try to keep track here with all the Alexioses. And they had Alexios IV killed in February 1204. So then Alexios Doukas becomes the emperor, and he is now Alexios V. Now the Crusaders, who are not, seemingly not in the city at this point in time, planned to attack Constantinople again, ignoring another letter from the Pope, reminding them that attacking the Byzantine Christians would result in what was actually would have been a second excommunication at this point in time. They had been they had been unexcommunicated, brought back into the church before this attack on Constantinople. And again, the Pope reminding them that, like, hey guys, you need to stop doing this because you're going to get excommunicated a second time. Now in April 1204, the Crusaders and the Venetians sacked Constantinople. Almost 1 million silver coins worth of valuables were taken during this attack. And this is why, for example, you see a lot of Byzantine treasures in the cathedral at St. Mark's in Venice, which I've actually had the privilege of going to, and it's really cool. You see like the 4 horses. There's a couple of statues around the premises of St. Mark's that you can tell are clearly not like Western style art or architecture. And so there's a lot of Byzantine treasures in Venice because of the sack of 1204. And this attack on Constantinople breaks up the Byzantine Empire. And this is why I say that you can essentially, although the Byzantine Empire does reinstate itself, by that point in time, there's really nothing left of it. The Anatolian holdings are basically gone, and it's almost really just the European Byzantine provinces, and for a while it's just going to be the little bit of Thrace that's left before the Ottomans take that over as well. But in its place, the Crusaders founded the Latin Empire of the East, which lasted for a couple of generations. Other small Greek states remained, such as the Empire of Nicaea, which is just across the Dardanelles there in Asia, the Empire of Trebizond, and the Despotate of Epirus also remains. Now, as I said, in a couple of decades, the Byzantines would come back in power in Constantinople, but that wouldn't really matter because by that point in time, it was only a matter of time until the once great Byzantine Empire would fully collapse. And again, that happens in 1453. So just a little over 200 years here before it all comes crumbling down. The Fourth Crusade really did put the nail in the coffin in terms of uniting Eastern and Western Christians, because from the Eastern Christians were already suspicious of Western Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, and the Western Catholics were certainly suspicious of the Eastern Orthodox. And I think I've talked about on this podcast before how there are some historians who say that the Western Catholics actually came to understand the Muslims in the Holy Land, they're the enemies. They came to understand and coexist with them in a much better, much more friendly situation than the situation between the Eastern and Western Christians. And relationships had been tense before that. They didn't really like each other before that. But with the sack of 1204, any idea, any possibility of a reunification between the Eastern and Western churches was completely out the window. There was absolutely no interest on the part, especially on the part of the Eastern Christians, to come back into communion with these Westerners who they already thought were loud and obnoxious and prideful and stupid and barbarians and uncivilized. And now they come in here and they destroy, the crown jewel city of Eastern Christianity and really of Christendom at that point in time in general. I mean, Constantinople was the largest city in Christendom at the time. It was it had the most in terms of like antique architecture, in terms of like they still had functioning aqueducts, which had existed since antique times. It really was still like an intellectual capital, financial capital, a trade capital, all these different things. And the West comes in and they destroy it, essentially. I mean, the city still stands, but in terms of the empire, it's really put on the ropes there to the point where it's going to hold out for a little while longer, but it's not going to do anything of note other than just withering away. And I think I've made the point here pretty well. In terms of, people always like to talk about how all of the missteps of the Crusades, the Crusaders did this wrong and they did that wrong, and wasn't it so terrible? Usually in reference to the Crusaders' actions when it comes to the Muslims. But this, apart from the Crusades up in the Baltic, where like the Teutonics were fighting the Lithuanians and the other Baltic people who are still pagans, a couple centuries from this point in time, this is really the biggest blot on the crusading movement. The biggest blot on the crusading movement is the sack of Constantinople in 1204, because the Byzantines are supposed to be your friends. The Byzantines should have been an ally, and Eastern and Western Christendom really should have been working in tandem to push back against the advances of Islam in the Middle East. Obviously, we can't know if they would have succeeded in permanently retaking the Holy Land or not, but their fighting with each other certainly never didn't help at all. And I know this has been more from this telling of the story of the Fourth Crusade has come more from a Western perspective. I haven't talked a lot about things about things exclusively from the perspective of the East, but this is how I've taught the Fourth Crusade in the past. I have taught a church history class, and this was actually, it's funny enough, excuse me, when I was getting ready to prepare this lecture, I thought to myself, oh yeah, do I still have the materials from when I taught that class? And I looked back in the folder, and lo and behold, there's like 5 pages worth of lecture notes that I used, because I remember writing it. I was definitely happy that I still had it, because then that meant I didn't have to write out a whole lecture. But anyway, if you've made it this far in the video, please make sure to give it a like, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode. And then if you are listening to us on Apple Podcast, or I just checked on Anchor earlier today, I think we are on Google Play or Google Podcasts or something. Give us a follow on there. Or if you're listening on Spotify, give us a follow there as well. And especially if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please make sure to give us a 5-star review. It definitely helps out the show. You can also follow us on Instagram at Professor Wren, where I post updates to the show and other things that I might be, updates as I'm working on lectures or other historical things or memes that I just find entertaining. So that's all I have for you guys today. And I'll see y'all next time.